Has Science Refuted Miracles in the Supernatural? This is actually the title of one of a couple of chapters I had the honor of writing and contributing to, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith. Harvest House had at least 2 books in a series. I don't know if they're going to be more. They had one before this that is now titled A Comprehensive Guide to Christian Apologetics, which I have about 7 articles in there. That's more like an article length kind of stuff rather than chapter. So there's some luminaries associated with this that I was not one of, obviously, but William Dembski, who actually taught at our seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, for about a year. Casey Luskin, I had the privilege, he doesn't really know me. Bill Dembski wouldn't remember me, and Casey Luskin wouldn't remember me, but one of my trips, I trek to South Africa every year for about 3 to 5 weeks around July, which is winter in the Southern Hemisphere, so I'm losing a month of my summer every year. But Casey was finishing his PhD at a university there, and we went to the Cradle of Mankind, which is actually one of these great UNESCO sites recognized around the world. It's this humongous museum on the history of the human race, and it's just Darwinianism out the wazoo, okay? I think that's the technical word, is wazoo. So Casey joined our group. There's a group of us there, Americans as well as local South Africans. And he took us on a real kind of low volume corrective as we're going around from site to site, and Casey's pointing out what's wrong with this Darwinian interpretation of this particular thing. So that was a privilege to do, to be a part of, tagging along with everybody. Joe Holden, also one of the general editors of it. Joe was one of our early graduates of Southern Evangelical Seminary, so yeah, he's now president of a seminary in California. So he's been a good friend. And then Stephen Meyer, who wouldn't really remember me either, but he actually taught one of our PhD classes at Southern Evangelical. So these guys and others are making this book possible. So I invite you I don't get residuals from it, so if you want to chase that down, I think this chapter that I wrote should be on my website. So I'll tell you how to get there. You'll want to go to richardghowe.com. Don't leave out the G, by the way, because I can't guarantee you what you're going to get. It stands for good looking. For some reason, people laugh when I say that. I'm going, Dave, what's the problem here? But at any rate, but that you can go there. If you see up at the top, there's a tab that says resources. That's what you'd click on. If I happen to mention during the talk, hey, I've got a paper on my website, that's where you would go. It won't go when you do that. However, I should add that sound effect just and it'll just do that, but it won't do that until then. That's where you would go, by the way, resources, papers. I'll have to make sure, Rebecca, help me remember to make sure I can probably upload that tonight if I hadn't already done it. Put the chapter on that so you don't have to buy the book if you are interested in the details that we're going to do here. But another reason you'll want to click on resources is you go to PDF decks. That's one of the icons you can click on. So I made all of the presentations I do, I think pretty much every one I've put together over the years for all my classes and all my speaking over the years, I converted to a PDF so you can get all the slides. Okay, so you don't have to frantically write a resource down. Hey, what book was that? What page was that? That kind of thing. So you'll want to get that there. Or, I mean, you can take pictures of the slides. I'm happy to do that. But just to save yourself the trouble, you can do that. You'll also want to get that slide deck here because you want to, two reasons really. One, this is part of a longer presentation. Now I've just truncated it for our purposes this afternoon. So you get the rest of the thing. A lot of them are quotes over and over again to make a point that I'll just make allusions to without reading. So you'll get those. And two, you'll want to be able to, what was the other reason? Well, in case there's one of those quotes, as I said, you'll want to get the reference. But there are slides that are just completely left out of here. So those are the two reasons there. All right. So let me define a few terms, and it's my fault that this got kind of messed up here. So sorry about that. But you can just imagine this thing right there being right here. So hopefully you can still read the word there. A few terms that I want to just define for our purposes. First of all, the word supernatural. In my experience, some people, maybe a lot of people, use the term supernatural refer not only to God, but to also any other spiritual or immaterial being or action. right? So say, hey, there's a movie, it's dealing with the supernatural, and it'll probably be something demonic, for example, right? You might see that. So according to this usage, the supernatural will include the being and actions of God, angels, and the paranormal, the demonic. That's a common use of the term. But I would urge you to consider that it's essential to preserve the term supernatural to acts of God alone. Now, this is just a stickler I have for terminology, so if you decide not to do this, I don't think it's going to compromise. But I think it's useful to preserve it because only God is truly supernatural, that is to say, beyond the natural, that is, beyond the created. Right? So there's creator, there's creation. That's basically reality. So I like to preserve the term supernatural for God alone. And then I would use things like paranormal, perhaps, or something like that if you needed a word for demonic activity. I don't want to give demons the credit of thinking that they're actually somehow beyond being created themselves. So Norman Geisler was co-founder of our seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary. And he contributed to the book In Defense of Miracles, which is part of what we're talking about here, Miracles in the Supernatural, a comprehensive case for God's action in history. And he defines a miracle as this. A miracle is a divine intervention into the natural world. It is a supernatural exception to the regular course of the world that would not have occurred otherwise. So the thinking here is that the natural world, especially living things, but the natural world more broadly, will always operate according to its nature, if you will. An acorn is always going to become an oak tree unless something goes wrong. It's burned or it's eaten or whatever. It'll never fail to achieve its natural end game. And that's true in the classical tradition of anything God created. But then what God has done, as Geisler's definition would indicate, has somehow interrupted that natural so that naturally, an axe head will sink to the bottom of the lake, but God can make an axe head float as he did. Or naturally, a donkey is not going to talk, but God can have a donkey talk. Those kind of things. So it's an exception in the sense that it's going against what would have happened otherwise. But there's still one other nuance here that I think I want to point out. So let me appeal to Louis Berry Chafer. Louis Berry Chafer was the founder of Dallas Theological Seminary that has a satellite campus here, and also a booth out there. And it was a seminary I went to for a couple of years before I interrupted my seminary studies and actually went back to university for reasons that aren't at all interesting to anybody but me. But at any rate, I did that to do philosophy instead. So Chafer adds the one other ingredient. Not that Geisler left it out. He just wasn't in the quote that I pulled out from Geisler. So what I like to do, I got a little water bottle here. And it is, who is this from? Members Mark. What is that? Is that a box store near here? Sam's? So I'm going to do product placement. So your speaker today is being hydrated by Members Mark. You know, hide the children. There. Now, they can't be responsible for the content, but maybe they'll send $1 million endowment for next year's conference. You never know with some of these things. At any rate, so Chafer, being founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, I thought his quote would add something to the definition that we've already put out. Though miracles are wonders in the eyes of men and display the power of God, their true purpose is that of a sign. They certify and authenticate a teacher or his doctrine. So this is kind of a standard definition in church history that I've been able to find, that a miracle is an act of God primarily for the purpose of vindicating a messenger or a message. That's not to say that God couldn't do a miracle solely out of his grace and mercy, heal someone. That's not to say that. But primarily, that's what I would argue, a biblical doctrine of miracles is. And by the way, I would invite you to another slide deck. Perhaps it'll be helpful. It's a slide deck on the website titled Miracles, a Philosophy, a Theology, and an Apologetic. And so I try to deal with what they are, why they are, and are they in that presentation. We're not going to do that here. I'm going to attenuate this more specifically against the idea of what science has to say. So there's miracles of philosophy, theology, and apologetics. I invite you to get that. Another term that needs to be defined for our purposes is science. This is a point of confusion in some writers that I've discovered. Ancient and medieval use of the term. Why do I mention that? Because if you read English translations of ancient or medieval thinkers, philosophers, for example, you will hear them use the word science to mean really any area of study or body of knowledge whose truths can be reduced to the first principles of that area. So any discipline, whether it's physics or astronomy or meteorology or anything that's an area of study that has fundamental principles that govern that area of study, that is referred to as a science. Certainly explicitly this way in Aristotle, and it's this way in Aquinas, for example. So the Latin word that would be translated, the Greek word, I think episteme in Greek, it would be scientia, where we get the English word science. So in this regard, not in this ancient and medieval use of the term, not only would areas like physics be regarded as science, but also metaphysics and theology. Now, to our ears today, that sounds like a violation. Well, theology is not a science, but that's because in the more contemporary use of the term science, the term science has become difficult to define to anyone's satisfaction, but one relatively uncontroversial aspect of the definition of science is that it is confined to the study of the physical or material world. I think that's pretty fair to say there. So it's obvious why now people would balk at the idea that theology is a science, since it's going to involve things like angels and the human soul and God, which are obviously not material beings. I just recently had been interacting and critiquing a writer who was very critical of Thomas Aquinas's theology and philosophy, and so much of his criticisms, he completely misunderstood the medieval use of the term science. So he keeps railing against Aquinas for using the methods of science to do theology. And it's like, no, he's not using the method of science today. He's using the methods of science as that word was defined in the Middle Ages and the ancient world. I'm not saying one's better used than the other. I'm just saying they're different. So while in this regard, while physics would be considered a science, metaphysics and theology would not. So the issue before us is whether there is any aspect of reality that is beyond the physical or material world, and thus beyond science in the contemporary sense of the term. That's what concerns me in this. Now, science by any other name, some scientists insist that science and its methods are the only way to discover truths about reality. I made an allusion to this in the earlier presentation, if you were there, and hopefully going to unpack this more for our purposes. They maintain, such scientists are people who say that miracles and the supernatural fall outside the scope of the, quote, scientific method. And I think if you ask a lot of thinkers, there really is no such thing as the scientific method. There are scientific methods, right? So don't die on a hill for one particular thinking of scientific method, hoping that everybody's going to agree with you in that use of the term. But whatever that means to somebody, whatever that scientific method is, whether it's hypothesis and testing and confirmation or whatever it is, whatever that scientific method looks like, the issue before us is whether any of those methods in any way are suitable exclusively to settle questions about the existence and nature of God and the existence of miracles. Our contention, obviously, as Christians, is that it is not. So this, in effect, amounts to saying that miracles and supernatural are not real. I mean, think about it. What's the difference between saying X is not real and X is real, but you can't say and think anything about X? It's like, well, what's the difference? I mean, that's basically tantamount to denying the existence of X if there's nothing about X that can be known or spoken about. So for the scientists, sometimes maybe in an olive branch say, well, no, we're just saying that it can't be, the questions of God and your Bible and stuff are just not amenable to the methods of science. As if somehow they were tacitly saying, but it's okay for you to have your Bible and your religion. No, most of the time they say, because it's not amenable to the methods of science, there is something ill-conceived about you even thinking there is a such thing as God or miracles in the Bible. Richard Dawkins was on record of criticizing another atheist who's a YouTuber who had gotten a degree earlier in his life in theology and just said what a total waste it is because it's a study about nothing at all, is what Dawkins said. Why would he say that? Because he thinks the tools and methods of science, the natural sciences, exclusively are the methods of knowing truths. in this kind of point of view, which not every scientist holds, we've got scientists here, if you've already been hearing, who are second to none in their science, and not all of them are even speakers. We've got other scientists here who are would love to talk to you and say, not all scientists are that way, but there's enough of them that are that way, that they've been given a label by their detractors known as scientism. Scientism would be this idea that science alone, that is, science in the modern use of the term, the tools and methods of science alone are the tools by which we know truths about reality. So that's the key word. Now, just be aware that not only is it the case that not all scientists hold to scientism, for the most part, those who hold to scientism don't use that term to self-identify. That's not what they call themselves. It's really a pejorative term. It's a critical term given by its detractors. So if you accuse someone of engaging in scientism, they'll probably take that as an affront to say, oh no, you're implying somehow blah, blah, blah. So just be aware that it's usually we critics here in this room that would call this point of view a scientism. But it seems to be appropriate because it is an ism in terms of a ideology that I think, I'll argue, does violence to the thing before us. Daniel Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, who is a philosopher, says, it's not scientism to concede the objectivity and precision of good science any more than it is history worship to concede that Napoleon did once rule in France and that the Holocaust actually happened. In other words, he's saying, just because we allow the historian to make definitive statements about history, you shouldn't disparage a scientist when he makes definitive statements with good science about the world. Those who fear the facts will forever try to discredit the fact finders. There's a couple of fallacies going on. It's a straw man fallacy. That's when you misrepresent your opponent's point of view. It's a straw man fallacy. The critics of scientism are not denying the objectivity and precision of good science. That's not what we're doing. He makes it sound like that we're somehow denigrating science. Broadly speaking, we're denigrating a certain ideology that plagues the thinking of certain scientists. That's what we're criticizing. He makes it sound like, oh, well, you guys just don't like good science. Further, that's an ad hominem. Those who fear the facts will forever try to discredit the fact finders. It's an ad hominem. That means it's an illicit attack on the person rather than a legitimate attack on the argument. This is an ad hominem fallacy. This does nothing to respond to the critics, to disparage us as being, well, you're just afraid of the fact finders. Maybe not. Instead, the critic of scientism is disputing whether the science alone is the arbiter of what constitutes facts in the first place, and whether scientists are the only fact finders. Do you see that? He's implying somehow that the fact finders are just people that do good science, and you shouldn't call that scientism. Well, I don't call good science good scientism. I'll call the ones who think it's the only method of knowing truths about reality. Those are the ones we're criticizing. So Dennett, I think, is just misplaced in his comments. The critics of scientism will argue that there are facts that are no less true about reality, but are not amenable to the tools and methods of the natural sciences for the most part. Now, there might be some overlap. I don't mean to say that there's nothing about that science can say that's relevant to the broader questions of God. Certainly, I think that's the case. But what I'm saying is, God's not a physical object that you could prove or disprove the existence of by some kind of standard method in the natural sciences. So you see scientism exposed not only among scientists, that I'll give you some examples, but even philosophers, which you would think would know better, as you'll see why I think that. So A.J. Ayer, very important voice in 20th century Anglo-American philosophy, probably someone you've never heard his name, but his book, Language, Truth, and Logic, was very influential for a while until the main thesis of the book was exposed as being self-refuting, and he admitted that it was and repudiated his idea eventually, which is kind of interesting. It's like, what a legacy to have. There's another sidebar about A.J. Ayer, who was at Cambridge University. In his autobiography, at least the first volume, because I didn't read the second volume, frankly didn't know there was a second volume when I read the first, but A.J. Ayer gives a story when he was on campus in Cambridge where he taught that he heard rumors of a faculty member at Cambridge having meetings with Christians about philosophy and things, and he thought that was just peculiar. And he said, and we met one day, He is faculty and this other faculty. We met one day in the Commons, and it flattered neither of us. That's what he said. Any guesses as to who that faculty member was? C.S. Lewis. Can you imagine? Neither of those guys had any concept of how long their shadow was going to fall on subsequent Anglo-American thinking, at least. C.S. Lewis and A.J. Ayers, just, I don't know if they cursed each other out or hit each other with fists. I mean, he didn't say, he just said it flattered neither of us. I thought that was funny. And so here's Ayers' take on things. We mean to rule out the supposition that philosophy can be ranged alongside the existing sciences as a special department of speculative knowledge. In other words, he's saying philosophy doesn't have, in his view, now he's a philosopher saying this, which is odd. Philosophy doesn't have any data to bring to the conversation. It doesn't have a subject matter that is its own. What will it do then? There's no field of experience which cannot in principle be brought under some form of scientific law, and no type of speculative knowledge about the world which is in principle beyond the scope of science to give. So notice, the philosopher as analyst is not directly concerned with the physical properties of things. He is concerned only with the way in which we speak about them. In other words, the propositions of philosophy are not factual, but linguistic. Now, if you don't already know this, part of what the propositions of philosophy have included traditionally are questions about the existence and nature of God. And so that's what he's meaning to include in this. It's not just other esoteric things that you and I may both agree are uninteresting and irrelevant to life that a philosopher may engage in, but it will also include things that we cherish as Christians, namely the existence of God and the attributes of God. Dennett against, well, let me skip that one because I'm gonna don't get too behind in my time. John Shook, whom I had the opportunity to debate some years ago at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Philosophical naturalism undertakes the responsibility for elaborating a comprehensive and coherent worldview based on experience, reason, and science, and for defending science's exclusive right to explore and theorize about all of reality, which is ironic because he's a philosopher saying this. It's like you just talked yourself out of a job. You just basically admitted nothing you say has anything to do with reality, or at least has any right to say anything about reality. But not surprisingly, you also find scientism among certain scientists. To be sure, the poster child for contemporary scientism is Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion. I think it's fair to say that until The God Delusion, the one treatise, more than any other one treatise, that probably did more to disabuse college students of their Christian faith was Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian, which you can get in the book Why I'm Not a Christian and other articles on religion or something. I forget the exact subtitle. But when Dawkins' book came out, I think it took first place, being responsible for more students leaving their Christian faith when they read his book. In fact, Frank Turek, some of you may know Frank Turek or know who he is, has a talk. I think this might be on the internet or maybe it's for sale through his Cross-Examine ministry. It's titled Intellectual Predators, where he talks about now I think the subject would be more on the critical theory. This was before that happened. But he gives accounts of, co-ed goes off to school, and after the first semester she comes home Christian, pastor's daughter, she's an atheist. Why? Because she read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. What does he say? The presence or absence of a creative superintelligence, that's God, is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. Because things can be in principle provable, but not provable in practice. I mean, if somebody said Neptune tastes more or less like Oreo cookies, in principle, that would be testable. That is, if you could get to Neptune and get down on and lick the planet or whatever, you could know whether it did or didn't. I mean, some way. But it's not really practically possible to do that because you can't get to Neptune in a lifetime and there's no planet to really yield down and lick anyway because it's gaseous. Well, all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a difference between principle and practice there. And he's just saying, well, even if it was in principle, it's not yet been done in practice. It's got to be a scientific. Here's another quote from Dawkins, and I'm going to come back to these here in short order. Unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. Let me just give you the context right quick. What he's talking about in context is apparently he's thrilled to discover some bishop, presumably in the Church of England, who wasn't postmodern. He was thrilled to discover that some bishop thought it's either true there's a God or it's false that there's a God. That this bishop wasn't, well, there's a God for me, but there's not for you. And so Dawkins is thrilled. He's like, hallelujah. Well, he wouldn't say hallelujah. Whatever the equivalent of hallelujah is. I mean, I'd have to think about what that would be with the atheist equivalent of it. But he was thrilled. Oh, good. There's at least one religious leader I've discovered who's not a postmodernist. So that's what he means, that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. I'm going to come back to that here in short order. Marcia McNutt also is another one. And I deal with some of these, or I deal with these and more in the longer version than I'm going to be able to do here. I'll skip Marcia. Peter Atkins, this quote actually comes out of a debate that Rebecca and I got to go visit before we were married. So if you watch this debate on the internet, be very careful, because while you might enjoy the part where the camera in the audience panning zooms in on Rebecca, that's fine, but it backs up real slowly, and now I'm right next to her, so you might want to hide the children on that one as well before that scene comes up. It's kind of hard to act nonchalant when you're watching the debate and there's this big giant light right in your face and a big camera, and you're supposed to act real, like you're not aware of it. I felt like Richard Dreyfuss in Close Encounters. I'd have to be red, sunburned on one half of my face. I'm just glad I wasn't doing that, and while they were filming me, I reach up and do that and just totally ruin the take. Like, okay, but now we can't use it. You just pick your nose right here in front of God and everybody. I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, anything, can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow, in their book, the last book that I know of that Hawking contributed to, The Grand Design, and they say, how can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Traditionally, these questions are for philosophy, or are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. Philosophy is not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. So in other words, he's saying questions that might have traditionally been the purview of philosophy are dead because the only discipline that deals with reality are the sciences, and obviously God and these kind of cosmic questions are not the subject of science. That's what he's getting at. It's a scientism. Which, by the way, I wonder what his philosophy department colleagues at Cambridge would think about the fact that their entire discipline is dead in terms. And I won't say that here yet. I'll say that in a second. So let me make a few responses to some of these, and God willing, we'll have enough time maybe. Nick and I were talking earlier was about, hey, maybe trying to do a Q&A. I said, what I really encourage them to do, especially if I get to speak, is just do Q. Okay? Because then you get a lot more questions in. If you just do Q and just skip the A, then it's a lot more profitable. That's a great question. Okay, next. Oh, yeah, that's really a good question. Oh, yeah. There were like 17 questions. That was wonderful. So let me respond to these. What about A.J. Ayer? We mean to rule out the supposition that philosophy can be ranged alongside the dictionary sciences, a special department of scientific, philosophical, or speculative knowledge. There's no field of experience which cannot in principle be brought under some form of scientific law. No type of speculative knowledge about the world in which it is in principle beyond the power to give. Here's what to watch for. Almost every one of the responses that I might make to the examples that I've garnered here and others all make the same mistake. Not only, but at least this one mistake. And that mistake is what they're saying is self-refuting. Because think about it. Can this statement that Ayer just wrote in his book, can that statement be, quote, brought under some form of scientific law? What scientific experiment could anybody do, a Bunsen burner or electron microscope or whatever it is, what possible scientific experiment could they do, the results of which would be that statement that he just made? And I submit to you, absolutely none. That's not a scientific statement. Then if it's not a scientific statement, then what kind of statement is it? It's a philosophical statement. That's what it is. That is a philosophical statement. And so that doesn't mean, well, at this point, I'm just saying it's a philosophical statement. So you've just refuted yourself, because since it's a philosophical statement, First if. Second if, the only truths that we can know are scientific statements, then it follows we can't know the truth of that statement you just made. Because you just made a philosophical statement which doesn't fit the criterion that the statement itself sets up. That's what a self-refuting statement is. It's like saying I can't say anything in English, right? Or bald people don't give public talks or something. Any way you wanted, I did that for your benefit, brother. You and me got to stick together here. So it's self-refuting. I mentioned in my talk this morning, some of you might have been in there for that probably the most valuable skill one can learn in studying apologetics is learning how to detect self-refuting statements. You know, when people say, well, there are no truths. Well, you just stated that as a truth. So what does he say? Oh, he is concerned, the philosopher, only with the way in which we speak about things. That's what he's arguing. All right? So you take those statements that he just made, and he says that these things are linguistic. Right? You go back here. So in other words, the propositions of philosophy are not factual, but linguistic. But is that statement factual or linguistic? Well, the way he puts it up, wrong way. The way he's putting it, as if it's a fact, that these philosophical statements are not factual. Well, you just made a statement that's philosophical, that's factual. At least you purport it as a fact. It's self-refuting. For error, exactly what it is concerned about, what is the philosopher concerned about? The way we speak about things, right? So if you think of things in the world, and then the physical properties that things have, weight, or mass, or color, or velocity, or location, or whatever it is, and then you think about the way we speak about the things that we say, about things that we experience, that's what he thinks the philosopher is. So the guy on the right is going to be the scientist who studies the physical properties of things, and the guy on the left is the philosopher who's concerned with the way people talk about these kind of things. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about the way people talk. In fact, that's what I'm criticizing, is the way these scientists talk about it. But I'm critical of the fact that someone could say, because it's self-refuting to say, that's the only thing that the philosopher does. Because sometimes the philosopher is going to make claims about reality, as we'll see in a moment. So according to Ayer, then, this gives another vocabulary word to get on. The natural sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, and if I left out your favorite natural science, forgive me, but that was all that would fit in my little bubble there. These are called first-order disciplines in philosophy. What that means is they are disciplines that deal directly with things that are real, right? And then, in Ayer's view, then philosophy would do with the categories of physics, chemistry, biology, or the logic of, or the glossary of, or the scope of. You know, where does chemistry end and physics begin? The relation to other disciplines of each of these. He's saying that's what philosophy does. And that's what philosophy is strapped to do, to make sure the natural scientists do a good job in, you know, all the P's and Q's and everything doesn't get muddled. And to be sure, we would probably agree with the assessment that in the past, in the history of the natural sciences, sometimes because the categories were wrong or were muddled, that was a bad thing, and we got over it finally. Like, say, the ether used to be a view that was common in the sciences, that the universe was sort of permeated by this kind of fluid, because they couldn't imagine light traveling through an absolute vacuum. So they had to have some kind of medium, just like sound needs air or water to transmit. Light would need something. That was the ether. They eventually give that up, and other things that we could put. So I'm not saying this. There's no role for philosophy to play, but these are called then second order disciplines. Why? Because they're disciplines that deal with first order disciplines. Right? Their object is not things. It's dealing with the study of things. So that's called a second order discipline. So in contrast to this, let me just sketch for you real quickly the classical philosophical tradition. I put classical in quotation marks because it's used in several different ways. You got classical understanding, and they're related. There's a classical education is going to deal with the educational application of classical thinking or classical philosophy. By and large, what I mean for our purposes is the thinking of the ancient Greeks, largely Plato and Aristotle, and the categories and methods that they bequeathed to subsequent Western civilization. And so the shadows of both of them still fall large. In fact, the four biggest contours of and forgers of the contours of Western civilization would be Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas there. And there are other voices that get them into the mix. But so our seminary, for example, not to lobby for SES over DTS, because I know the philosophy professor over DTS, and he's a good friend of mine, who's here, by the way. And he's doing his breakout right now. In fact, why don't we just all go to... No. We just all walk in the middle of his breakout going, we just gave up on ours, going to hear yours. But SES is... Norm Geisler was a Thomist, an aficionado and a follower and disciple of Thomas Aquinas. Evangelicals today, understandably, break out in a rash when they hear the word Thomas Aquinas, because he's today about the only place you're going to find a Christian talking about Thomas Aquinas is a Catholic. So evangelicals are like, man, that sounds Catholic to me. What's going on? You're talking about Aquinas? What are you? It's like, no, it has nothing to do with Protestant and Catholic, because Aquinas' thinking endured in Protestant thinking well into the Puritan era. I mean, well into the 17th century. And I show that in another presentation I do. I don't get residuals for you hitting my website, but at any rate, how theology needs philosophy. And I try to show these things, this is where we get this stuff. A lot of our ideas of what truth is and what a human nature is and that kind of stuff. So the classical method is going to agree that there are these natural sciences, the contemporary classical, and it will agree that these are first order discipline. But it will also say philosophy brings actual data to the conversation. That's actually its area exclusively to deal with. Now, these categories should mean little to nothing to you unless you've studied philosophy. So I'm not putting this up here as if they're all self-evident. Oh yeah, of course, the particular universal. I was just thinking about that this morning when I was talking to my mom. Of course, I don't mean that. I just mean these are, in fact, the categories that guide and have guided a lot of Western thinking. And I'll go this far to say a lot of the theological codification of foundational Christian doctrines like the Trinity and like the two natures of Christ, like human nature and these kind of things, the philosophical side of those conversations, because there's certainly a theological side too. I'm not trying to denigrate that. I'm just doing this as a philosopher. The philosophical side of those conversations were heavily infused with these kind of categories and such. So if you're curious about what some of those look at, you can get the classical philosophy PDF decks. I think they're on the website as well. It's a class I teach. But at any rate, this makes philosophy a first order discipline. This is what Ayer is saying is not true, that the only first order discipline is science. Natural science, rather, science in contemporary use. And I'm arguing, and Christian apologists should lobby for, no, philosophical thinking is also a first-order discipline. Now, we might disagree over some of these points that some philosophers may make and others, just like people might disagree with some of this science. They might be a string theory or a Copenhagen interpretation of quantum or any kind of number of contentious issues in some of the cutting-edge sciences and stuff. But that doesn't negate the legitimacy of science just because scientists are still debating certain issues. Same thing with the philosophy. Some of these things might be debatable, but I think it still points to the viability of philosophy as a first-order discipline. And then I would gladly acknowledge, and it also plays that second-order discipline role as well, that Ayer. All right, so that's going to be the difference. Whereas the things that are the purview of the scientists and only secondary discipline or second order discipline by the philosopher, you go, note that the entire position that Ayer has put forth is neither a physical property of a thing, nor is it the way we speak about the physical properties of things. Now think about that again. Here's another level of it being self-refuting. Ayer's book neither falls under a first or second order discipline. It's a book about second order disciplines, which if you had to call it, say, well, you've just created a third order discipline, which your model doesn't allow for. It's self-refuting. It's speaking about the way we speak about. It's speaking about is what he's doing. Now, you might want to say, well, there's a legitimate role for speaking about things. Fine. But it just negates and refutes Ayer's point. That's the point I'm making. Because his position that only science deals with first order is just evacuated. So anyway, I just kind of unpack what I just said. What about Dennett? Well, just look on the slide deck. In every instance, see what is being said by that person that is self-refuting, that they set up criteria that doesn't fit the very point that they're trying to make. And it happens with Dennett. It happens with John Shook. Here's a book, although the quote I gave you wasn't from this book. It's actually from a website. So you can get the URL from the slide. But there's his book on the God debates and stuff. And so that's the thing to look at. But I want to take a few seconds to talk about Dawkins. Although I answer the other ones, or try to at least, in the slides that you can get. Many people have been able to believe in God. This is my setting up of the problem before I give you my response. Many people have been able to believe that God is real merely by observing the wonders of creation. I think best case scenario, nobody can miss connecting the dots, can they? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork. Who can look at a starlit sky? I've heard there is a such thing, but we don't have them in Atlanta. I doubt you don't have them in Burke, Virginia either. But if you get out far enough, there is a such thing called a starlit sky. Okay, you just got to get away from the ambient lighting. The heavens declare His righteousness, and all the people see His glory. For since the look how quirky this language is. For since the creation of the world, talking about God, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. How? Being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. What I tease my students and challenge them to take some of my classes at the seminary is, okay, so how can you begin with what you see, hear, taste, touch, or smell and demonstrate the existence of a God who's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-wise, all-loving, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, blah, blah. What does that argument look like? I go, that's a good question. And it's not hard to find what it looks like, because that demonstration has been part and parcel of Western thinking certainly since the church fathers, utilizing the categories of Aristotle and Plato. And they've made these demonstrations over and over again. That's what frustrates me so much about contemporary atheism, is because they seem to be just totally oblivious to how the conversation about God's existence has been going on for 2,500 years. At least read a book or something. Don't just, one of the colleges I was at, but I ended up transferred to another, or going to another school, didn't graduate, but one of the professors said something when he walked into philosophy students, and he pretended like he was real gruff, like a curmudgeon, but he really had a twinkle in his eye and was a teddy bear. And he said, well, we here don't believe philosophy just started in 1920. And he's making a slap at air and this scientism that began to plague. In other words, we think philosophy goes all the way back probably to the ancient Greeks, for better or for worse. For when the Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who, every time I've heard this verse quoted and talked about, it's always misquoted. The verse says, who show the work of the law written in their hearts. But every time I hear somebody quote this verse, they say, well, the law is written on the hearts. It couldn't be the law that's written on the hearts, because he just got through saying, when the Gentiles who do not have the law. Well, if it's written on the heart, it wouldn't be true that they don't have the law. What do they have? They have the work of the law. What's the work of the law? That same word is translated later in chapter 2 of Romans, deeds. The deeds of the law. And I submit to you to consider, without argument here, that what he's getting at here is the things towards which the law of God is pointing you. These what we would identify as moral goodness as human beings. That's something that people can know in their hearts, this teleological kind of natural law understanding. If that means anything to you, then you need therapy, basically, if it means something to you, because what I just said was philosophy. No. If that means anything to you, great. If not, don't worry about it. Paul also attests to it in Acts 14, about God's superintendence of the history of the world as evidence of God. So we've got God declaring His existence in nature, in the stars, in the heavens, as the Psalms tell us, in the things that are understood according to things that are made in Romans 1, or according to what the heart knows about what the law is aiming us towards in terms of moral goodness, in terms of God's supernatural superintendence, if you will, of the history of the human race on planet Earth. All of these and more are all attestations to the God of the Bible. But, as self-serving as it is for me to say this as a philosopher, as more toxic philosophical voices and scientific voices impacted by those toxic philosophical voices have fogged the conversation throughout history, especially since the 17th or 18th century, the need arises to appeal to deeper issues in philosophy. I mean, I just think that's just the fact. I'm not saying everybody has to run out and get a philosophy degree. You could pick a similar kind of problem in other disciplines as well. What maybe some MDs are saying, hey, we're having to do things now with some of these mutant viruses that we've never thought about before, and now we're having to rally the equipment to deal with stuff. I could see, well, you got a similar thing going on in other disciplines as well, but it's going on in philosophy. There have been voices that have come in that I think have fogged it. Think about this. From the ancient Greeks to 17th century or so, the humanities, metaphysics, ethics, human psychology, theology, flourished through the Middle Ages. But what we identify as the natural sciences was almost non-existent. It's quaint and kind of simplistic that when we read Aristotle, or even Aquinas about human production or about what we identify as inertia or something like that, we kind of look back on it and say, well, there was nothing. And then right about the 17th century, they just swapped places. How could it be that I'm being hyperbolic? How could it be all the scientists and philosophical thinkers all believed in God until about the 17th century? Now none of them believe in God. They're all atheists, it seemed like, doesn't it? With the Richard Dawkins. You go, what in the world happened in the history of ideas that it's just this radical upheaval? So now, theology, you're just wasting your time if you're studying theology, Dawkins would say. And human beings, we're reducible just to our DNA. We're just, as Frank Turek likes to say, moist robots that are just confined to the deterministic laws of the physical world, with a little quantum caveat thrown in now and then, whatever. And you go, something's got to explain that. Well, I describe it collectively as toxic. That's what explains it. Dawkins would probably celebrate it. So let's go back to this quote. I want you to see, maybe it wasn't obvious before, but I hope to make it obvious. Let me compare the two quotes. By the way, The Blind Watchmaker, if you are interested in scientific apologetics, you should read Richard Dawkins, especially Blind Watchmaker or Selfish Gene or whatever. Read people like that to be conversant in their arguments so that when you are arguing with somebody, you have the credibility because I've read these guys and I'll read the next one you want me to read. And that's a telltale sign of being a healthy thinking person, a telltale sign of a cult. And I'm not talking about children or people young in their faith, but I'm talking about adults grown up in their faith. A telltale sign of a cult is when the leadership tries to dissuade you from ever reading opposing points of view. You say no. So that's what we do in our contemporary atheism classes. Except for one article we read, everybody we read are all the atheists, as good as I can find. And it's a lot worse for the atheists than you would think, in my judgment. Their case is weaker than I've ever seen it before as I started reading more and more of these guys. But anyway, you'll have to take the class to find out. Blind Watchmaker now, you're talking, I don't know what year this goes back to, but it's long before the God delusion. And remember, just to remind you, unlike some of his theological colleagues, Bishop Montefiore is not afraid to state that the question of whether God exists is a definite question of fact. The presence or absence of a creative superintelligence is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. Notice this is not a change in Dawkins' point of view, but he says it two different ways, decades removed, to make the same point. It's just that one of them is a lot more transparent than the other. Because I agree with him, it is a question of fact whether God exists. It's either true there is a God or it's false. We're making a claim about reality when we say there is a God. We're not just merely making a claim about, I like, cookies and cream ice cream, or I like asparagus. We're not just making claims about personal preferences. We're making claims about objective reality. And we're either right in making those claims or we're wrong. If you think I'm wrong, give me your arguments for why you think I'm wrong. And if I can do my best, I'll try to answer those. But notice how he says it here, and it's not a change of view. It's just a change of being a little bit more transparent. That it's a scientific question. Well, now, wait a minute. I grant it's a question of fact, but without argument, he just asserts that the methods used to settle that fact, or debates about that fact, are the methods of his natural science. Well, you got to give me an argument for that. I don't think you can give an argument for that, because eventually the argument you give won't be a scientific argument. It'll be a philosophical one, which you think doesn't have any role to play. So you see the difference there is just difference in wording, not difference in content. And I think it's false. It's a question of fact, because if there's not a God, that's still a fact, isn't it? But the problem with Dawkins is he thinks he's answered the question sufficiently for his own purposes merely by confining himself to the methods of the natural sciences. I use this illustration or imagery in the morning breakout. What Dawkins is doing is like somebody who's trying to find seashells on the seashore with a metal detector. And you go, but your method is already filtering out the data. It's already done that. It's because seashells are made of calcium carbonate, they're not made of metal. So the tools you're using is already sabotage your ability to answer the question. If you really did have some kind of calcium carbonate detector, I don't know if there is a such thing, and then that showed there were no, okay, that's fair. My detector that's designed to detect X failed to detect any, so either there aren't any X or something else is wrong with my detector, whatever it is. All right? And so I deal with Marcia there in the thing. Let me say something about Peter Atkins. I believe that anything that has been reported reliably, anything can be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science. Now, this is a rhetorical question, so just think about it. I don't want you to answer out loud, but just think to yourself. Can Atkins' statement, quote, be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science? Don't answer out loud. Just marinate in that for a second. Can his statement, quote, be interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science? I think that that's the wrong question. Because I think it's possible, well, you could interpret anything within any framework. Nobody's going to stop you to do that. Can you interpret the statements about miracles in the framework of Lord of the Rings? I'm not sure what that would look like, but I suppose I could. Set up those as boundary and template, and what would Frodo think, and what... You could do that. To me, the question is, can Atkins' statement be correctly interpreted scientifically within the framework of modern science? So for him to say what he said sounds, well, how magnanimous can you be? I mean, no, he's actually just saying not that it just merely could be, but that it can only be interpreted that way, which then is a form of scientism. Well, there's a problem here because his statement is not framed in the framework of modern science. This statement is not a scientific statement. Or here's this statement on the right. That's not a scientific statement. That's a philosophical statement. It's a philosophical statement in the second order discipline version of philosophy. It's a philosophical observation about the scope and glossary and such of a first order discipline to point out that they're being inconsistent. What about philosophy is dead? Well, it reminds me of this conversation. I've seen this in various versions. Dude guy said, hey, what good is philosophy? I don't know. What good is science? Well, science, now you're doing philosophy. There's a great meme, too, about theology, too, with Thor and the Hulk, Bruce Banner. It's got great pictures out of the movies, and one of them is just like, well, you don't really need theology, you just need Jesus. And the other one's like, well, really? That's interesting. Well, who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is, now you're doing theology. Same thing, right? You can't have Jesus without theology because you wouldn't know who Jesus was without theology. You can't have good science, or at least can't talk about what good science is and understand what it is without philosophy, since the question about what it is and its scope and is itself a scientific question. So I mentioned this, the metal detector thing, and I mentioned earlier this morning the fallacy of a selection effect. That's what that's about. That's the fallacy that the metal detector. These guys have the selection effect. When physicalists completely miss the evidence of God because they are being scandalized or sabotaged by their own presupposition of, namely, only the natural sciences can give you the truths about reality. Now, I haven't really given much of an argument to prove that philosophy has much more to say than maybe the few examples that that I gave here, but that can be done in another setting. So let me summarize it. The failure of scientism. We've seen that the fundamental mistakes of scientism in its failure to distinguish questions that are scientific from questions that are philosophical. The methods of science, as that term is commonly used today, are limited in their ability to plunge the depths of the nature of reality. There's more to reality than the physicists can tell you. Contemporary science often seeks to give answers along the contours and categories of mathematics, for example. But on the occasion of our encounter with the sensible world around us, the human intellect is able to know truths that are beyond the physical, which is to say, metaphysical truths. What are some examples? Well, you saw some earlier. Teleology, what is that? The four causes, efficient, formal, final, material. The distinction between substance and accident. The distinction between your black Labrador and the black of the black Labrador. The Labrador is a dog. That's a thing. That's a substance. The black is an accident or a property. That distinction is Aristotle. The distinction between universal and particular, the distinction between form and matter, the distinction between act and potency, the distinction between essence and existence. So with these metaphysical truths, the classical philosopher, that is the Thomist, can demonstrate the existence and attributes of the God of classical theism with that list right there. You give me that list, I think as a philosopher I can demonstrate the God of the Bible, the God with all the superlative attributes. That's exactly what has happened in church history. A shameless self-promotion here, Southern Evangelical Seminary. I'm doing 2 classes. You can take these as audit. You don't have to, get them for credit. Christian Apologetics, which is a 1-week module class. It's like a marathon. January 8th through the 13th. 6 to 10:30 Monday through Friday night, and 8 till 2 on Saturday. It's all through Zoom. It's all live stream. And it's actually recorded and archived on our course management. So even if you couldn't make any or every night, if you register for the class, you can watch it after the fact. And we deal with some of this, though it deals with a lot more things than just these preliminary. But then more maybe relevant would be the contemporary atheism class, which is a Thursday night class. It Zooms from 6:30 to 9:30 on Thursday nights. And I don't get paid according to how many students I have or whatever, or how many classes. I just teach the same number of classes and stuff. So anyway, all right, but we do have like 3 minutes for, just to finish that, whether or not this God that has revealed himself to us, whether the God that philosophy demonstrates is the same God who's revealed himself through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is more of a historical question than it is philosophical. All right. Yes, sir, question. False. Oh, sorry. I jumped the gun there.
A non-locality.
Okay.
Established by logic, although science, physics, used it was the method to get there. And that has to do with reality at a quantum level.
Okay.
So we say truth corresponds to reality.
Yes.
And I do agree that at our scale, that's so. So can you comment on this fundamental nature of the reality that we call the material world, where non-locality is now a thing?
So the first thing that comes to my mind is, I think it's wrong, and you weren't necessarily doing this, but I see this lurking in the thinking of some people who might leverage that question, that I think it's, for some things in reality, its reality is constituted by something metaphysical about it, like a human being. I would assert that human nature, or the what is called in philosophy the form of what a human is, that's a metaphysical constituent that dictates what form the matter takes to be the DNA. I would argue we're not human because we have the DNA. We have the DNA because we're human, because being human is something more than just our physical constituents and stuff. So that's the first thing. So when it comes to questions like the reality of some material, any given material thing, which you weren't really framing it in terms of a specific material thing, I think in terms of the artificial things like a table, when we think, well, the table just merely is an aggregate of certain types of molecules, I don't really quarrel with that, because there really isn't a nature that a table is beyond just a concept in a mind. The reality is the material stuff. Now, then the question, I think, gets a little closer to what you're asking about. Okay, so how do we trace the reality of constituent parts like molecules and then subparts of molecules and all the way down to quarks until you get to the what's going on with quantum and stuff. And I'm not really sure how to navigate some of those. One source that I would commend to navigate these deep waters is a book, but the author's name is Connell, Connell, called Substance and Modern Science, where he tries to see if he can connect the relationship between some of the classical metaphysics and then contemporary particle physics at least, and that still may not go deep enough for what you're asking. But I think anything about which we could say it is true, then is also real in some sense, even non-locality. If it's true, then it's a truth about reality. Otherwise, there's no non-locality, which they obviously wouldn't say. Anyway, that's the most I can do off the top of my bald head. All right, I think we're out of time, Mr. Doolally. We got one thumb left. Oh, wait, 1 minute or we're out? Okay, we're out. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. God bless.